Welcome back, everyone. Thank you very much for rejoining us after a fabulous lunch. I'm so sorry, Adam, Sebastian, John, that you cannot join us, and the rest of you cannot join us, could not have joined us for an extraordinary lunch. But here we are in this mixed format. We now return for 4 sessions in a row rather than the usual 3. We are going to be talking about donor, philanthropic, university, and NGO responses, and we'll also be joined by Reverend Barber at the end of this set of sessions. We begin with Adam Gameron, who is the president of the W.T. Grant Foundation. Wonderful to see you, Adam, again. It's been a long time. And he will be speaking on donor and philanthropic responses. Adam? We see your slides.
Thank you, Carola. Yep, thank you, Carola and Marcelo and everyone for welcoming me to this conference. I am sorry that I'm not there in person. Sounded like a great conversation yesterday afternoon, and I'm sure it will be stimulating this morning or this afternoon as well. Can you see my slides okay?
Yes, we can. Thank you, Adam.
Great. So let's see. There we go. So I've been asked to talk about the donor and philanthropic response to the pandemic with respect to children. Of course, no short talk can encompass the vast diversity of responses from the donor sector from the philanthropic sector to the COVID-19 pandemic. As the saying goes, if you know one foundation, you know one foundation. I'll narrow my focus in 2 ways. First of all, I'll zero in on the themes of this conference, children and inequality. And second, I will focus on a particular interest of our foundation, the William T. Grant Foundation, which is based in New York City, which is support for scientific research. So my title, From Action to Research to Action, reflects both the urgency of the present and the salience of the future, the need to plan and to use research as a tool to plan for the long term. I'll discuss 5 topics. First, the philanthropic response to the immediate crisis. Second, the pandemic in the context of multiple crises. Third, inequality within and between nations. Fourth, establishing a new normal that is not like the old normal. And I so appreciated the conversation yesterday afternoon, which made this point. Fernando Reimers and others made this point very strongly yesterday. And last, I will explain the role of research to reduce inequality in child and youth outcomes and the role of philanthropy in supporting such research. So the response from the philanthropic sector to the COVID-19 pandemic has been massive. According to the Center for Disaster Philanthropy, more than $32 billion have been donated from foundations and corporations since the start of the pandemic. These efforts, these contributions have focused mainly on mitigation, vaccination, and treatment. Some headliners include the Gates Foundation's dramatic commitment to vaccine development, which has not been without its controversies, but in monetary terms has certainly been large. The Ford Foundations and others issuing bonds to increase their giving at a time of need, in some cases doubling their giving more than they would normally give in this time of need. But this is about the immediate crisis. What about the broader context and the future? We need to understand the global pandemic as a reflection of 4 simultaneous crises. And I'm not the first person to point this out. President Joe Biden and others have made this point. But we're really talking about 4 crises. The first, of course, is the health crisis of COVID-19. But simultaneously, we face the economic crisis wrought by the pandemic, the racial reckoning that has erupted in the US alongside ethnic polarization and violence globally, and the climate crisis, all happening at the same time. So philanthropy's response to the pandemic is not just about health, but all of these arenas. Each has importance for the welfare of children, particularly the most vulnerable children. They must be considered and addressed in combination, not singly. Consider inequality within and between nations. So within nations, of course, we witness unequal educational opportunities, unequal access to technology, unequal access to healthcare, racial and ethnic discrimination and prejudice. But at the same time, we also confront inequality between nations that needs to be addressed in part by the philanthropic sector in this time of simultaneous crises. So unequal access to vaccines and treatments, again, the headline. But there's also unequal economic resources, which is the basis for unequal access to vaccines and treatment. Infrastructural disparities. And philanthropy must respond to inequality at both levels. So the immediate crisis response has been to provide first economic support for families with children. And in the United States, this came largely from the federal government, which through essentially a child allowance, provided a tax credit, a refundable tax credit, which cut child poverty by nearly 50%. And this was a remarkable development, something that's been advocated for years, something that our philanthropy and others supported a major national study by the National Academies of Science, documenting what steps were necessary to cut child poverty in half. And lo and behold, with the American Rescue Plan, this plan was actually put into place, and it did indeed cut child poverty in half. Unfortunately, it has not been extended post-pandemic. Second, releasing youth from detention. So youth accused or convicted of crimes are held in detention centers, and during the COVID pandemic, they were vulnerable to illness, and including severe illness. And our foundation supported a research synthesis in conjunction with the National Council of Family and Juvenile Court Judges, which gave judges the tools they need to keep young people out of detention during this health crisis. And it was so important because judges recognize that whatever the sentence for these vulnerable young people, it is not a sentence to illness or hospitalization or even death. And that's what, the pandemic was rampant in detention facilities. And yet judges are in a precarious position because, as you may know, you let out one person who goes on to commit a crime, a subsequent crime, and the pushback you get, it can be ruinous. And so by providing the judges with the tools they need of balancing risk, that they were able to dramatically reduce the number of youth held in detention during the pandemic. This is yet another marker that has snapped back to the old normal, which has levels of detention that are far too high post-pandemic. Support for refugee children. Another effort of our foundation has been to some researchers and workers at World Relief Durham in North Carolina to develop a school curriculum and after-school program to help settle refugee children in that community. And this had a very successful pivot to a virtual format during the pandemic. In fact, so successful that in contrast to the other two responses that I just described, this is continuing in the virtual format post-pandemic. It's a way of reaching parents successfully and has helped both teachers and students accommodate to their situation. And now this community, most recently, this community has received an influx of Afghan refugee children and is applying the same parent engagement resettlement effort to help the refugee children. Reaching vulnerable populations with treatment and vaccine has been another immediate response to the crisis on the part of the donor and philanthropic sector, as well as commitment to technology resources for education. Now, I am going to argue that research to reduce inequality is a key to the new normal. That is a normal that is less fraught with inequality, less fraught with discrimination, less fraught with unequal allocation of resources post-pandemic than pre-pandemic, and therefore would have a better foundation for our most vulnerable children. So this is a four-part argument. First, inequality is excessive. And you can see this in many countries. The US really stands out in excessive inequality, but Thomas Piketty made this argument in Capital in the 21st century across Europe. Second, excessive inequality is harmful. It is socially divisive, and it's a drag on our economic productivity. But third, we are not paralyzed in the face of increasing inequality. On the contrary, inequality responds to social programs and policies. It's demonstrable. And therefore, we need research to identify the programs and policies that effectively reduce inequality. The pandemic makes this agenda even more urgent, and that is the special niche of the William T. Grant Foundation to support research to identify programs and policies that effectively reduce inequality. So as a first step towards this new normal, we can apply lessons from existing research. For example, the US government and philanthropy are combining forces to unfold a massive tutoring effort to address learning loss caused by the pandemic. In addition, we have decades of research on trauma response, which can be applied in education and other settings to try to help children cope with the trauma, loss of caregivers, disruption in their lives, social isolation, all the traumas that young people have experienced during the pandemic. Third is food and housing security, both of which affected during the pandemic. We had a moratorium on evictions that is now ended, so families are once again being evicted from their homes if they're unable to pay their rent, which may be the case due to a loss of provider, a loss of job, or the dramatic inequality that was already afflicting this nation and many others. Juvenile justice reform, as I mentioned, it's one thing to let kids out of detention so they don't get sick and die during a pandemic, but rates of juvenile detention are too high and conditions are too harsh as they are, and so we need reform in juvenile justice, and research can point the way. Immigration reform, we know steps that can be taken successfully to support immigrant origin children and families in the US. One of the most important steps we can take in this country and others is to ensure that immigrant children have access to the social supports and rights that they are entitled, which they often do not receive, and our existing research points to that very strongly. Border policies, inclusion of immigrants in the social safety net, and so on. But new research is also needed. New research is needed to address the intergenerational transmission of poverty. It's one thing to say, all right, if we create a child allowance, that will reduce child poverty because families will have more money. But that is a short-term fix. And what we need is a long-term fix. We need to empower families to raise children so that in the next generation, they will not be based in poverty. And here in the US, the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine has just convened a new consensus panel to synthesize the research on stopping the intergenerational transmission of poverty. Second, we need new research on building the social identity of minoritized youth. All too often, responses to addressing the challenges of youth from minority backgrounds, low-income backgrounds, and immigrant communities has been to emphasize assimilation, integration, conformity. But it turns out that building the racial and ethnic identity and fostering a critical consciousness so that young people understand the basis of their circumstances and can push back against it, it may be a more effective way to support the healthy academic and social development of young people from minoritized backgrounds. So research is underway on this. We need more of it, and then ultimately we need to capitalize on it with programs and policies that support the development of young people. So here at the William T. Grant Foundation, we have supported a lot of research on programs and policies to reduce inequality. But it turns out that even if we successfully identify programs that benefit the young, vulnerable youth to which they are targeted, and even if we can scale up those programs to many places, we're still not going to get very far in actually reducing inequality until we disrupt and overturn the structural foundations of racism and economic inequality that created the need for those programs and policies in the first place. I always like to give the example of the growth mindset. You know, the growth mindset is the idea that anyone can succeed. No one is born smart, no one is born dumb. With hard work and effort, all can succeed, all can learn, as compared to a fixed mindset that says that you have what you have and you can't change it. So it turns out that because of discrimination and oppression in our society, young people from minoritized backgrounds often are not have the opportunity to develop the growth mindset. And if you can implement an intervention for the growth mindset, then you can close gaps between disadvantaged and advantaged children. Well, what if we address the conditions of racism and discrimination that create the need for the mindset intervention in the first place? Wouldn't that be a more powerful and lasting way to reduce inequality? So we are calling now for research on social movements and tax redistribution strategies, reparations for descendants of enslaved persons, land return for colonized populations. These are a few examples of research that's needed to establish a new normal that is less unequal than what we've had in the past. Finally, a new modality, a new approach to research is needed. That is research based in community partnership. This claim comes from research on improving the way evidence from research is used in policies and practices that affect young people. Producing high quality research is not enough to get the findings used, even if it is timely, relevant, and accessible. You know, initial efforts to get evidence used recognize that there was a bridge or a gap between research on the one side and practice and policy on the other. So how to get across the bridge? Well, initial efforts focused on building a bridge and moving in one direction, from research to policy. Researchers figure stuff out, and they tell the policymakers and practitioners what they figured out, and then the policymakers will naturally act on these pearls of wisdom. The research needs to have rigor, incentives, translation, and dissemination. We need to tell what we've learned so that others can act. That was the initial conception. It turns out that conception does not work very well. Instead, what is needed is a two-way process where researchers are listening to practitioners and policymakers to jointly develop a research agenda so that it can be pursued together, and so that if questions that practitioners really need answers are pursued in research, then once the findings come out, there's a chance that they would actually be used to improve practice and policy. So this means not only rigor, incentives, translation, and dissemination, but also relevance, engagement, capacity. In short, it's about building relationships between producers and consumers of evidence, and those bridge builders, those intermediaries who knit the two together. Why focus on partnerships? Well, for researchers, it provides an opportunity to understand the local context, to learn about needs and questions, to provide insights that facilitate new research. And at the same time, policymakers and practitioners can also benefit from gaining access to existing research, from contributing to research that is relevant to their context, from receiving assistance with efforts to use research. So this is a matter of changing how we work. It's a way to make sure decision makers' voices are reflected in research agenda, to engage partners who can help us make sense of the research for the local context, to build sustained and trusting relationships, which ultimately increase the chances that research will get used. and to establish organizational routines that create opportunities for learning. So what do we hope to accomplish with these efforts? What is the aim of a philanthropy as we come out of this terrible pandemic? Some funders come up with the answer, and then they want to support research that drives towards that answer. Our approach is different. We start with a question. We count on the research community to provide the responses. Community partnerships help ensure that the right questions are asked and that the answers are useful. Post-pandemic, we can establish a new normal. Reducing inequality requires political will and research-based knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adam, for your wise comments. And we have like 5 minutes and 42 seconds, which is great, for questions and clarifying questions and commentary. And I would like to make one quick commentary. I was with you at the foundation when you were developing the thinking around community partnerships. And I, to this day, think a lot about the wisdom from that. And it was great to see you again go through why it's important. And I just want to draw on the talk that Pearl gave this morning. And I would add one more reason to your list of why it's important. And that is researchers can come up with decisions why something's important, like, oh, vaccinations are good for the world. But if they don't work with the community to mobilize them and understand the local reasonings behind why they may not be culturally relevant, if it's top down, if it's coming out of an ivory tower, there won't necessarily be an uptake. So working with the community to understand resistances and local understandings would be another reason I think that is really important. And I think this pandemic gave us an opportunity to understand why it would have been good if more community partnerships had been involved on the ground in practice.
Thanks, I certainly agree.
There are a lot of questions.
Thank you so much, and thank you for this very interesting presentation, which is, of course, music to my ears, being in charge of UNICEF Office of Research Innocenti, which is a dedicated research center where we work very closely with 180 country offices. But I'm not going to do any advertisements for the work we do. Just to say that I'm going to steal your words and the bridge over the chasm, and I will utilize it in my own work going forward with others. I have a question, very quick one. Co-creating research with young people. Could you say a few words about that? Everything else you said, or everything you said, I've agreed to very much. I would like to hear a few words about co-creating research with young people and children. Thank you.
Yes, in fact, we are seeing a boom in youth participatory action research, where young people are involved in identifying the challenges that they face, in developing research questions, are guided by experienced researchers in carrying out research activities and in pulling together knowledge and interrelating it with their own experiences. So for example, a study of barriers to reducing inequality in the Boston area was carried out by Margarita Alegria, a noted scholar of mental health. Currently, Emily Ozier, a researcher at Berkeley, is leading a group of young people to address the challenges of student absenteeism from school. Each of these is an example of youth participatory action research, where the youth themselves help identify the questions, speak with their peers, and furnish some of the evidence that is used under the supervision and with the guidance, and ultimately with the write-up of experienced researchers to answer questions in their environment.
Thank you. Vittorio?
Thank you, Adam. I was too very happy to hear at a certain point in your presentation when you talked about new ways of doing research. If you succeed in that, you will get a special prize. Because it seems to me that today, in particular in the social sciences, there is the following problem. We know that distinction between deduction and induction, everybody. But we kept on forgetting in recent times the third dimension, which is abduction. Abduction means that before you start the research from an hypothesis, you have to check whether or not that hypothesis does make sense or not. The fact is that today everybody says, well, I start from this hypothesis and so I look for money to get finance to carry on the research. So a lot of money is wasted and the results are very meager, very poor, because not every hypothesis deserves to a full research. Before, you have to check whether or not the hypothesis does make sense. That is what the Greek called abduction. That is particularly relevant in the case of pandemic. Consider, for instance, the relations between environmental degrade and the spread of the virus. There is, I cannot say that I went through all the publication, but the vast majority of publications were a real waste of time and above all of money, because people started from a very strange hypothesis and then using correlation methods instead of causal analysis, they arrived at a conclusion which was disproved by the facts. So if you could instill, using the funds of your foundation, which I understand you are the president, this habit, that would be really a very important and big contribution to the advancement of our knowledge. Thank you.
Yes, I agree with your remarks. I think they're completely consistent with the stance I've taken in this talk. And indeed, when we evaluate research questions for our competitions, we're asking, what is the inequality and what is the lever for change? And then what are the outcomes? How will we know? And only applications that can pass that three-part test are successful. But a part of this problem is the way universities are structured and the incentive system in universities, where social science researchers tend to focus on testing the theories that come out of their disciplines instead of solving real problems in their communities. And that is a problem. That's why the research proceeds as it typically does. Suppose we valued research not only for its ability to test scientific theories, but also for its ability to solve real problems in the world. We could have markers that would evaluate. We could take, just as we now get testimonials from other researchers saying, this research influenced my research, we could get a testimonial from a policymaker that says, this research influenced the policy I promoted. Just as we now have quantitative markers of research productivity, like citation counts, we could have quantitative markers of how much research is mentioned in public debates or in legislative deliberation. So we can reshape universities to incentivize and encourage partnership-oriented, engaged scholarship. We could do that better than we have.
Thank you very much, Adam. We have one more question from Pearl joining us from South Africa. Please, your question, and then we will turn to Melissa.
Oh, okay, I had written on the chat box that I will comment at the end, but just a quick one. I really like the emphasis on the type of research that is to be done at the end, Adam. My only two comments is, the foundations especially, and their relationship with vehicles such as NGOs, I wonder what, and I'm not really expecting a question right away, but just to plant the thought, what is the threshold of sustainability of the interaction? In other words, I'm not saying, and I can imagine that the risk of dependence must be watched, but at the same time, in order to be able to make an impact, there needs to be some kind of sustainability leeway between the support and the vehicle, which might be the NGO. But there is the other side of the coin, which is my second point, which is that there's politics in communities. which the foundations and NGOs can walk into. So there usually is a need to analyze the politics and define the boundaries so that you don't walk into political squabbles around big things such as land, and then fail to make an impact on real souls on the ground. Those are just my 2 comments.
Yeah, thank you for those comments. I have a better answer for the first one than I do for the second. I think the sustainability is a primary goal of the partnership model. The idea is that the partnership is long lasting and survives any transition among individual leadership. So the partnership model is well geared to address your first point. Second point is more challenging.
Thank you so very much, Adam. I would please join me in thanking Adam for his wise remarks. All right, now
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here and to listen to my colleagues whose ideas are keeping me going, I must say. My heart is very sad right now about the war that's going on and the invasion of Ukraine and the obscene provocation by my government of Putin. So I'm sad and upset about that. But in my field of the sex trade research, I have just learned that 2 things are happening. One, we're being flooded with online porn shot by cell phones of Ukraine girls right now. This is what's being produced. And this is what happens in wars to vulnerable women. The second thing that's happening is that right now on German sex buyer forums, which is where men chat about where they can buy a human being to use for sex, cheap, who will do whatever they want. Right now, the sex buyers are chatting about how much fun it is going to be to see all these Ukraine girls coming into the German legal brothels. So I feel the way I imagine some of you feel about this. It's hard to put it into words. But this is what happens to vulnerable women. And this is what I'm going to talk about today, some of the roots of this kind of vulnerability. Okay, we can start with a picture of a 2,000-year-old beech tree in a Romanian old-growth forest. This tree is 2,000 years old. As we speak, organized crime groups are clear-cutting the Transylvanian forest, which are protecting, of course, all of us, just like the Brazilian forests are. This is my friend Amelia Tiganas, who is a Romanian survivor of prostitution. Here she's speaking in Germany about how legal prostitution was her own concentration camp. She's a very courageous woman. I am a clinical and research psychologist from Prostitution Research and Education in San Francisco. Our NGO produces research for the purpose of social change and policy development. So you can imagine my delight at hearing the last presentation. That's what we've been doing for 20 years. And we have just celebrated our 50th peer-reviewed publication, which we produce with local NGO partners in countries around the world. We have a library of free resources at prostitutionresearch.com. The COVID pandemic has had severe impacts on women in the sex trade, who are among the most vulnerable women on the planet. Because of quarantines, social distancing, government's neglect of the poor, systemic racism in all walks of life, failure to protect children from abuse, and the predation of sex buyers and pimps, COVID threatens many women's ability to survive. In order to understand prostitution and the risks taken by women in prostitution during COVID, we must understand what it's like to be anxious about access to food and shelter. How do you wash your hands without a sink? How do you stock up on food without money? Or shelter in place without a home? Asked an Italian homeless advocate at the beginning of the pandemic. There's a 75% overlap between homelessness and prostitution. Knowing they were risking their lives, many women prostituted during the pandemic. Poverty will kill us before the coronavirus, said an Indian woman in prostitution. Taking nightmarish risks to support their families, prostituting women in Cameroon, sought out sex buyers in hotels that were being used to isolate European men with COVID symptoms. It's time to make the connections between the business of resource extraction and the business of sexual exploitation. A free market approach to extracting resources reflects the almost religious belief that everything should be for sale. Anthropologist Peggy Sanday studied 156 cultures in which she categorized them as either rape-free or rape-prone. When the land was free of exploitation and destruction, women tended not to be raped. And when there was environmental degradation across all these different cultures, there was a much higher level of sexual violence and other interpersonal violence. Now, the cultural, political, and spiritual expression of these ideas has been alive in indigenous cultures for a very, very long time. They treat Mother Earth like they treat women. They think they can own us, buy us, sell us, trade us, rent us, poison us, rape us, destroy us, use us as entertainment, and kill us. I'm happy to see that we're talking about the level of violence that's occurring against Mother Earth because it equates to us. What happens to her happens to us, said Lisa Bruner, who's White Earth Ojibwe in North America. Women's subordinate status means that when climate catastrophes occur, their access to safety and economic survival are threatened. Poverty, age, ethnicity, caste, disability, and geographic location put women at different levels of risk. Climate stress puts girls at risk for early marriage, which is one form of prostitution, and there's a name for it, famine marriages. Extractivism is connected to the notion of sacrifice zones, places that to their extractors don't matter and therefore can be poisoned, drained, or destroyed. Extractivism is a dominance-based relationship with the earth that's connected with fantasies of racial superiority. Because in order to have a sacrifice zone, you need to have people and cultures that matter so little that they're sacrificable. the attitude that we can sell or rent a human being as a sex worker is the same credo as that of men who cut down thousands of acres of Romanian old-growth forest to sell to IKEA for cheap furniture. IKEA. This is the attitude expressed by a sex buyer who was interviewed by Victor Malarek, a Canadian journalist. I was buying a product. They didn't matter as people. They didn't exist as people. They were just whores. Sexualized racism entrenches the bigotry that women of color and poor women are disposable, and indigenous women are at the bottom of a race and class hierarchy, both in and out of prostitution. I would like to talk for a couple minutes about two phases of extraction businesses. The first phase, prostitution, is launched and expanded when there's a boom market in an extraction industry. Second phase, prostitution's also linked to longer-term climate changes, droughts, fires, and floods that affect people's ability to survive. Here's what that looks like in a diagram form. You have resource extraction, and the immediate effect is the arrow that goes to the left, a boom in prostitution. The longer-term effect of resource extraction is climate change, which then itself produces poverty, which leads to prostitution. Here's an example. Large numbers of men are hired to work on pipelines, fracking, mining, logging operations. Historically, these industries have exploited young, poor men who are paid more to perform jobs that no one else wants to do because the jobs are dangerous and unpleasant. Organized criminals like pimps, traffickers, and drug dealers come in to feed off the economic boom. Women and girls are trafficked, that's pimped. Trafficking, pimping is the same thing. They're all organized crime. Women and girls are trafficked by pimps to these boom zones. For example, the Bakken oil fields in North America, gold mines in South Africa, coltan mining in Colombia, and logging in Brazil. Same thing happens in all parts of the world when you have an extraction industry rolling. When an extraction sacrifice zone is developed, what happens to the women and girls in nearby communities? In North Dakota, in the Bakken oil fields, sexual assaults, domestic violence, and prostitution increase very dramatically when large numbers of pipeline workers come in to work in these military barrack-style housing called man camps. Even when an extraction industry shuts down, the newly organized sex trade remains an enduring legacy of extraction and colonization. And this happens everywhere. There are also links between poverty, racism, sexism, and long-term climate change. In the global South, climate heating has already damaged the ability of many women to provide food and water to their families. As everybody at this conference knows, education improves the status of women and decreases vulnerability to prostitution. So young women in Ethiopia and Bangladesh have explained to us that climate stress increases sexual violence this way. Girls used to collect water for their families, and it took 2 hours a day to carry a 30-pound jug of water. After a drought, it takes up to 6 hours a day to get the same amount of water to their families. The farther the girls had to go, the greater the risk for rape. And because they were exhausted following this strenuous water collection, they couldn't concentrate on their homework. The economic and social forces that channel poor and ethnically marginalized young women in prostitution were evident after Hurricane Katrina in the US in 2005. In the 2 years after the economic devastation caused by the hurricane, young women from New Orleans were pimped to Las Vegas. New Orleans is an economically stressed area with a long history of slavery and race discrimination. That was the source region for young, poor African-American girls in Las Vegas, with its welcome mat for sex buyers, was the destination market. When women are unable to find jobs, when economic supports for housing, childcare, healthcare, and education are cut, then women in the US have prostituted for hamburgers or a tank of gas. A 2016 study showed widespread hunger among teenage girls in the US who are prostituting in order to feed their families. The crucial question is not, did she consent to the prostitution, but has she been offered the choice to exist without prostitution? When women in prostitution are asked what they need, first on their list is housing. When governments fail to provide shelter to women and children, pimps provide housing via prostitution. Let me say a few words about harm reduction versus harm elimination. Extraction industries allege that drilling for oil can be made safe. Despite spill after spill, they maintain they can fix the pipes. Prostitution harm denialists say the same kind of thing. It can be made safe if legalized and regulated. There's no evidence for this at all. We need research on this. We have some, so do other people, but that's not quoted enough. There's a tension between those in the climate justice movement who want an immediate ban on fracking and those who think that they've developed best practices in partnership with oil industry groups that would permit drilling and supposedly mitigate environmental damage. This is the same tension that exists between those of us who want to abolish prostitution and those who think they can fix it, which I don't think is a fixable institution. We need prostitution abolition, and we need fossil fuels left in the earth. So in conclusion, I would say that it's essential to confront sex inequality as a root cause of vulnerability to climate change. Climate adaptation must build on existing efforts by women's rights organizations to protect and support girls. A forced choice between poverty and pollution should not be government's only options. And a forced choice between poverty and prostitution should not be women's only options. We need a feminist economics that puts women at the forefront. I want to say some words from Viet Thanh Nguyen, who wrote, "The biological virus affecting individuals is also a social virus whose symptoms include inequality, callousness, selfishness, and a profit motive that undervalues human life and overvalues commodities. Our real enemy is our response to the virus, a response that's been degraded and deformed by the structural inequalities in our society. These structural inequalities affect all of us, but for women in the sex trade during the pandemic, they're life-threatening. the transformation of oneself into a sexual commodity leaves a gnawing sense of degradation and misery. COVID has exposed the failure of malignant capitalism. Who's going to pay for it were the last words of a dying man as he was put on a ventilator. The pandemic has highlighted how we all are failed, not only the marginalized and prostituted, every one of us. So we must reject the notion that there's a special class of human beings, mostly young, mostly female, mostly poor, mostly ethnically and racially marginalized, who deserve prostitution in order to survive. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Melissa, and we have 5 minutes and 58 seconds to open it up for questions and comments before we move to the next speaker. The most sobering. Jeff, I can see your hand up.
Are there big differences in this vulnerability across the high-income countries? You know, for example, we think that Scandinavia takes better care of the basic needs of everybody. So you would think that there would be less desperation and desperate resort to prostitution. So does that show up? Is there evidence of the cross-country differences of rates of prostitution, and does it show that social policies can really make a big difference? It seems very plausible that it does.
Countries' prostitution policies make a huge difference, yes. I don't know about the class, although I'll say a couple things about that. But when you have a policy that criminalizes the demand for sex, as Sweden did in 1999, Norway, Finland, Norway, Iceland, Israel, France, Canada, 8 countries in all have passed these laws aimed at going for the root cause of this institution that's so harmful. It has driven down sex trafficking. In Sweden is where the longest term study has been done. And we know from a study out of the London School of Economics by Cho, Dreyer, and Neumeyer that across more than 150 countries, whenever prostitution is legal, trafficking increases. It's a very strong result. Now, the question about social services is really important. Right now, we are interviewing women in Stockholm, asking them about the quality of social. These are women in the sex trade who've had porn made of them. And we're asking them what social service agency they've been to, were the police helpful, was housing authority helpful, were other NGOs helpful, and we're going to learn a lot, I think.
We now need to, although it has more time on the clock in order to sort of stay on schedule, we're going to turn to Jack DeGoia, the president of Georgetown University, who will speak about university research in the age of COVID. Thank you very much for joining us via Zoom.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It's an honor to join you and to offer these brief reflections on university research in the age of COVID. And I'm deeply appreciative of the opportunity to have listened to so many outstanding presentations. In my reflections, I'll focus on 2 themes. First, the possibility emerging from the experience of these past 24 months for a focus on ever more challenging problems. And second, on the importance of drawing upon resources that can support and strengthen our people who are taking on these challenges. I think we can count on an extraordinary global infrastructure in support of understanding some of the disruptions and dislocations that we have discussed over these 2 days, a global research infrastructure. As Kathleen McCartney shared in her presentation yesterday morning, it's nothing short of astonishing how much we already know about the impact of the pandemic on psychosocial development of children and adolescents. And as we have learned from all other presentations, it's equally astonishing how much we have learned about other domains. And this is an extraordinary infrastructure that continues to strengthen. The convergence of new forces, globalization, climate change, growing inequity, new technologies, has required the development of new approaches to research, new ways of organizing research, new structures. Jeff Sachs is responsible for the development of one such example, the Earth Institute at Columbia. Our colleagues at UNESCO and UNICEF have supported other types of approaches that push beyond traditional disciplines and seek to connect methods and approaches in new combinations. Adam's presentation is the most powerful example you could imagine of a demonstration of this kind of commitment to enriching the nature of research. Over the past decade, the National Academy of Sciences has proposed the concept convergence science to capture this dynamic that I think we all know well. I think we should have some confidence that universities will respond to the challenges of understanding exceptionally well. Universities will be part of this strengthening infrastructure, primarily because the university is built on the centrality of knowledge. That is the core of our identity and purpose. 3 elements constitute the university. First is formation. We provide a context for the formation of young people. That is, along with the knowledge that becomes transmitted through students' coursework and faculty engagement, we value the importance that all students explore and develop the intellectual, moral, social, spiritual, and civic dimensions of their selves. Second element is inquiry. We support the scholarship and research of our faculty. In essence, we are contributing to the discovery and construction of knowledge, as well as establishing a home for epistemic communities that establish the conditions for truth. And third is the emphasis for every university on contributing to the common good. We contribute to the common good of the communities in which we participate. Common good, there's a good we can achieve together that we could never hope to achieve alone. These 3 elements, formation, inquiry, common good, constitute the very idea of the university. Inquiry, scholarship and research, is the work that holds these elements together and differentiates the university from other places where formation occurs, other institutions that also contribute to the common good. The work of inquiry has been on display throughout the pandemic. We have seen examples of this astonishing work here together in the presentations of our colleagues over these 2 days. The work of inquiry has, in these just past times, enabled an extraordinary explosion of knowledge, actions, treatments, insights, an awesome display of inquiry. Significantly, universities have been and now are at the forefront of the effort. And while the work of inquiry focused on pandemic particulars is ongoing, it continues also into the work of how we understand what we are doing and what needs to be done. Analyses, treatments, policies have emerged from our universities, collaborating in public with one another, with the private sector, with municipal, state, and federal governments. The emphasis has been, by and large, on following the science And this is all the work of inquiry. And now I think we must ask, given what we have learned and our learning about inquiry during this pandemic, can this learning be applied elsewhere? As we move forward, can we apply our learning to so-called wicked problems? How can we characterize wicked problems? It's a term that captures a range of problems that, whether by definition, interpretation, inability to confront, are defined as wicked. Here's how the appellation was originally described and displayed. Horst Riddle and Melvin Weber, from the abstract of their 1973 paper introducing this concept. And they identified 10 characteristics of wicked problem. Others have used different terms to describe this idea. Russell Akoff, writing in 1974, every problem interacts with other problems and is therefore part of a set of interrelated problems, a system of problems. I choose to call such a system a mess. Akoff used a different term than Riddle and Weber. Instead of wicked problems, he described them as social messes. Well, is this helpful? Can this characterization of wicked problems, of social messes, can it enrich our capacity to expand, enrich, deepen our work of inquiry? Does this concept help to explain why some of the problems that we have discussed together over these 2 days, why some of them seem so intractable? Why are some of the issues we have discussed so intractable? Can this concept enrich our understanding of the nature of inquiry? These are challenges that universities in their inquiry roles take on as a matter of course. What is problematical is examined as part of the work of the university. I believe some of what we have learned through these past 24 months in response to the pandemic has strengthened the capabilities and capacities of our universities to be able to imagine taking on these ever bigger problems. I wish to close with a reflection on those who do the work, those members of our universities, our faculties, our scholars, our graduate students, our postdocs, increasingly undergraduates, those who engage in inquiry, those who will be taking on these ever more challenging problems. As we have strengthened our universities, are there steps we can take in support of our people? And a convening like this, held in this location, opens up the possibility of a discourse drawing upon more resources, spiritual and moral resources, that might be more challenging to explore in our more typical academic conferences. So I speak to you from my office, from the oldest Catholic and Jesuit university in the United States, and I wish to share one element of a 500-year-old tradition that animates our community. Early in the interview that perhaps more than any introduced to the world the way of proceeding of Pope Francis, Father Antonio Spadaro asked the Holy Father the following question: what does it mean for a Jesuit to be elected Pope? What element of Ignatian spirituality helps you live your ministry? And Pope Francis responded with the word discernment. He said, and I quote, "Discernment is one of the things that worked inside St. Ignatius. For him, it is an instrument of struggle in order to know the Lord and to follow him more closely." Close quote. Little background, St. Ignatius is the founder of the Jesuits. Discernment is a transformative practice outlined in the Spiritual Exercises, a guidebook that St. Ignatius wrote for the practice of discernment. For Ignatius, we must pay attention to our interiority with special attention to the feelings, to the affect that we are experiencing, movements within us. For Ignatius, the beginning of his insight came in convalescence from an injury suffered in battle. He was a courtier whose leg had been shattered when hit by a cannonball. More than his leg, his entire world was shattered. His self-identity, one who, in his words from his autobiography, his chief delight was in the exercise of arms with a great and vain desire to gain honor. And that identity, following the injury, was hard to sustain, but not without trying. In convalescence, he asked for books that would feed this identity, requesting tales of chivalry. With none to be found, he was limited to 2 sacred texts, a life of Christ and a book of the lives of the saints. What emerges in the interiority of this young man is an experience that might have resonance with each of us. There were interior movements that brought him joy. And there were interior movements that brought sadness, a heaviness, even dread. He gave us words that describe these contrary interior movements: consolation and desolation. In his convalescence, when he was reflecting on reading sacred literature and allowing his imagination to flow, consolation. When he reflected on his life as a courtier, desolation. For Ignatius, we are not to ignore or reject or run from these interior movements. We are to try to interpret them. What are they telling us? What could they mean? Where are they leading us? If they are leading us toward consolation, then they can be trusted and we need to reflect with them. And if on the contrary, they need to be understood, resisted. What is this work of interpreting these feelings? This is discernment. Ignatius encourages careful attention to our interiority, especially to the affect we experience. One more term. The word is sentir, an Ignatian word that is difficult to define. Here is a passage from Father Brian O'Leary. Sentir is a key concept for Ignatius. It defies any efforts to force it into either an intellectual or an affective category. It successfully spans both. Hence the difficulty of translating it by any single word. Phrases like have a felt understanding of a truth, or to have an experiential and affective knowledge of a person or a thing are awkward, but they are often necessary circumlocutions to bring out the rich spiritual meaning of the original. There is a powerful idea at work here that we can attain felt knowledge, knowledge that we just know in the deepest parts of our being is true. And we have both our intellect and we have this practice of discerning the affect that we each experience in our interiorities. Ignatius asks us to privilege the significance of our inner lives. Colleges and universities are dedicated to the acquisition and dissemination, the discovery and construction, the interpretation and conservation of knowledge. Together, these knowledge developing activities determine the orientation of the university. Can we draw upon additional resources like those offered to us by Ignatius, discernment, consolation, sentir, to assist us and to support those who take on this work as we build upon the work of these past 24 months and seek to tackle the most complex social problems? Thank you.
Thank you so very much, President DeGoia. These was very moving and such important reflections as we think about moving forward in this work, and especially as we support people who have been on the front line, educators, nurses, and researchers doing work in this moment of crisis and in the new crisis we're approaching. I will not take questions right now because the Reverend Dr. William Barber is, we've successfully managed to get him on Zoom after a bit of crossed wires yesterday. He is the president of the Union Theological Institute, and he will be speaking to us about, about the church's response to the pandemic. Thank you so very much, Reverend Dr. William Barber. Thank you very much for joining us.
Hello. Good morning. How are you?
Welcome. Good morning.
I do want to, first of all, thank you for allowing me to come on and be with you. And I also want to just make a slight correction. I'm a bishop with the College of Affirming Bishops, and I'm a distinguished visiting professor at Union Theological Seminary and co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign National Call for Moral Revival. And I'm so honored to be with you. I was just stuck in the conversation about Ignatius because being a part Pentecostal and Congregationalist, this idea of knowledge that we know deep within, regardless of what people may try to say to us, is so important of a theological framework. One of my professors actually taught us that you can call your religious experience whatever you want to. You can say you were sprinkled, baptized, immersed, filled with the Spirit. But at the end of the day, if it does not produce a quarrel with the world's injustices and a eternal discontent with injustice, particularly as it relates to how the poor are treated, then it renders that claim of spirituality terribly suspect. And I'm glad to see the spirituality on this call. I'm honored the Holy Father, Pope Francis, endorses this work. My dear friend, Jeffrey Sachs, invited me on your behalf to be a part of this work. I actually received a note a few weeks ago, and it said that they wanted me specifically to talk about children in this pandemic and why the church cannot allow, we must take on several lies. One of them is the lie of scarcity. There is no scarcity of resources. And then the distortions that we really don't know how to fix this. We've known how to fix this. Even in 1948, the UN Declaration of Human Rights was clear on what was needed. But what we seem to have a problem with is the lack of a consistent moral consciousness in our public theology and public policy. I was actually at the UN speaking to the Special Rapporteur on poverty even before COVID hit, and then since COVID came. And one of the things he said to me is, Reverend Barber, we don't have a lack of resources in the world. He began to explain what he meant by that and how much is actually available to address these issues. Secondly, he said, we don't have a lack of ideas. It's almost similar to the pandemic. My daughter is a public health Ph.D. out of Harvard, and she said to me with others, Dad, we knew everything we needed to do to address this pandemic up front, and it would not have cost us nearly 1 million lives. In fact, one study at Columbia University said 60% of the people who died didn't even have to die if we had followed what was known. But there was a refusal at some of the highest levels to do that. And so he went on to say, so what we do have is a need for a transformational moral narrative, of a transformation of our moral narrative and our moral framework. So in light of that, I want to talk a little bit about where we were before the pandemic and where we are as it relates to children. And from my perspective of having to be, being a pastor more than 30 years in America and being engaged with the Poor People's Campaign, but then to say if this is the reality here, it is even more so in other nations, because if the nation that claims to be the wealthiest nation in the history of the world has not fully addressed these issues, then we know that there is deep trauma around the world. I want to start in the text, and something that has great exegetical importance to me and to the church, and also pulls at a deep place in our spirits when you hear it. Isaiah chapter 10 in the Message Bible says, woe unto those who legislate evil and rob the poor of their rights and make women and children pray, not P-R-A-Y, but literally make women and children pray, P-R-E-Y. And the ancient prophet said, this comes about not as a matter of personal choice, but as a matter of deliberate deciding to legislate, to pass unjust law. And then, of course, in Jesus's words in the red letters of the gospel, as he was closing his earthly life in Matthew chapter 23, verse 23, Jesus begins to discuss the issue of religiosity as it relates to tithing. And he says something that should disturb us all. He says, you have done all of these things, tithing, as you should have done, but you have left undone the weightier matter of the law. And the first one is justice, kindness, and faithfulness. You have left undone the weightier matter. When we look at this, and then we think about something that Dr. King said in 1967 in a writing called The Three Evils of Society, Dr. King said, again and again and again, we have deluded ourselves into believing the myth that capitalism grew and prospered out of the Protestant ethic of hard work and sacrifice. The fact is that capitalism was built on the exploitation of the suffering of Black slaves and continues to thrive on the exploitation of the poor, both Black and white, both here and abroad. King was called everything for saying that, socialist and everything else, but what he was saying as a Christian preaching prophet was a critique of mythology, because mythology can take on a life sometimes stronger than the truth. And he said, if we believe a myth, and then that informs our moral and political action, then our moral and political actions will be also driven by a myth, and we continue to recreate the myth. Isaiah 10 and Jesus in Matthew tell us clearly, make us clearly that we cannot look away and believe in these myths that people choose to be poor, children choose to be poor, but that poverty and low wealth are results of actions, political actions, deliberate actions. And those actions and that legislation often grows out of what King called a mythology that if you just work hard and sacrifice, that everything will be all right. And anybody who's poor, adult, or child, then they are not working hard. They are not sacrificing. And that is the mythology that keeps us from addressing the public policy issues that we face before COVID. Dr. King also said that any country that puts more in war and militarism than it does in lifting up its people is headed toward spiritual death. And then finally, he said, there must be a better distribution of wealth. And he said, and maybe America must move toward democratic socialism. This is Dr. King in 1966. If he had lived and had a chance to unpack all of this, where would we be if we had really decided to address the violence that Coretta Scott King called violence, social violence? Like poverty is a form of violence, denying people health care is a form of violence. But where we are, even now, is we face a crisis of possibility, civilization, and democracy. And even here in America, we get lost often in the debate about top lines in legislative packages, or whether we need to means test something, or whether we need to make sure that poor people are not cheating the system. These become the questions, whether or not we have enough money in a society of $21 trillion gross domestic product. And what happens is we get locked in to either the mythology, as Pope Francis has said, of trickle-down economics, or the mythology of neoliberalism, and we do not deal with the truth and how we can provide for everyone's need. And that's why the church has to be engaged in public policy through our focus in moral public theology. Because we're too often caught up in the contemporary movement about whether a policy can pass in the Senate, whether it can pass in the House, how much will it cost if we do it? When Joseph Stiglitz, the Nobel Peace Prize economist, who was an advisor to the Poor People's Campaign early on, said the real question is not what does it cost for us to do it, what does it cost for us not to do it? The reality is the greatest moral voices are poor and low wealth, both in America and around the country. And the one thing that they know is that we cannot continue in our country or in the world leaning into the denial of what's possible and the lies of scarcity. I love the way Pope Francis said it. God bless him. Today we see the world as has never been so rich, yet despite such abundance, poverty and inequality persist and grow. And in these times of opulence, when it should be possible, not just to discuss poverty or to address a little bit of, but to end poverty, the Holy Father said. The powers of one-track thinking say nothing of the poor, the elderly, the migrants, the unborn, and the seriously ill. Mostly invisible, they are treated like disposable. And we in the church cannot allow people to remain invisible. We certainly cannot allow policy that treats them as though they're disposable, and especially when it comes to our children. COVID-19 pandemic put a spotlight, for instance, I know in America, on the nation's poor and low wealth workers. It put a spotlight, it laid bare, it exposed two great fissures of our society, systemic racism and systemic poverty. It exposed them. It did not create them. It exposed them. It worsened them, and it exposed them. It showed what we were and how for too long the nation had neglected the very people we ended up calling essential, but even much of the church had neglected. There was a Pew study that was done a few years ago examining 50,000 sermons and what was being taught to the people from the pulpit. And when the computer kicked it out, the word poverty, the word justice didn't even register as 1% of the sermon that people were hearing. Didn't even register. The issue of truth, the issue of the woe unto those who legislate evil, rob the poor, scriptures like that. The more than 2,000 scriptures in the Bible that speak to the issue of how we treat the least of these did not even register as things that were preached about and taught from the pulpit in the American pulpit. Even though when that study was done, already before COVID, and we did a study on this called The Souls of Poor Folk in 2018, and we update it every year. 43% of Americans were poor and low wealth. That is less than $500 away from economic disaster. And 52% of the children in the nation, 39 million children. 41% of our elders, 21 million. 42% of men, 65 million. 45% of women, 74 million. 60% of Black people, 26 million. 64% of Latinx people, 38 million. 48% of Asian people, 8 million. 58% of our indigenous brothers and sisters, poor and low wealth, before COVID ever hit. 33% of white people, 6 million people were poor and low wealth before COVID ever hit. 40 million more white people in raw numbers than Black people. And yet among Black people, 60.9% of Black people are poor and low wealth. Before COVID ever hit, there were 62 million workers who made less than a living wage, and many of them are families, have children. Before COVID ever hit, 53% of all Black workers, most with families, made less than a living wage, a living wage of just $15 an hour, which was asked for in 1963 at the March on Washington. And in reality, should be over $20 an hour today. Think about that. It took African Americans, for instance, 400 years to get from nothing to $7.25 an hour. If you think about slavery, that's zero. And now the minimum wage in our country is $7.25. It has not been increased for 12 years. And yet we still do not pay a living wage before COVID. The Mailman School of Public Health noted before COVID, 250,000 people were dying a year from poverty. Over 700 people a day were dying from poverty before COVID. There's a debt, and they did a look at the denial of healthcare, denial of living wages, and found that in every one of those things, there's a death element. They're not benign. People literally die from government policies. Woe unto those who legislate evil, rob the poor and women of their rights, and make women and children pray. P-R-E-Y, not P-R-A-Y. Policies that make people pray. Policies that become carnivores of people's lives, and the church must challenge that. In fact, in America, in the 13 most southern states, with 52 million people are poor and low income, 24 million white, 28 million people of color, 13 million people are totally uninsured. This is the South, where the civil rights movement was born. And the number of poor people in those 13 states make up more than 1/3 of all the poor people in the country, and the highest level of children in poverty. I was putting this together, thinking about your question, what's going on with children in the midst of this. Now, when COVID hits, we already had all of this economic stress, but we had parents of children who were already, they were not paid enough to build up savings to tide them over in an emergency. They lacked paid medical leave and health insurance. They lacked access to unemployment insurance. They lived in expensive but overcrowded accommodations, and they already could not take care of their children. They were the first to be forced to go to work. We call them essential workers, but did not change policies. So many of them were treated as expendable. They were the first to go to work, first to get sick, first to spread it to their children, first to die, and the last to get the vaccine. And we still do not know. Your question to me about children, here's the thing, and why we have to have this kind of discernment that was talked about earlier and deep dive. We do not know yet the true public health impacts of COVID on the 140 million people alone in America and on children. What we do know is that poor and low income households are more vulnerable to the economic impacts of the pandemic. What we do know is when we did pass a child tax credit for a minute, 90% of low income houses spent their child income tax credit on food and housing and utility payments and clothes and education, even though there's some politicians now trying to say they spend it on having a good time. What we do know is that in America, for at least, all of the pandemic era programs like child income tax credit, and earned income tax credits that benefited poor and low income people, and for a minute lifted some people out of poverty for a few months, are gone. They're over. So we found out that policy can actually address poverty, and now the policies are gone. We know that if we had kept expanding the child tax credit, 35 million households would have been lifted. We know that the child income tax credit benefited 4.7 million children. 1.7 million are white, and 960,000 were Black, and 1.7 million were Latino, and 200,000 were Asian, but it's gone, it's gone. We know that expanding the earned income tax credit benefited 17 million low-wage workers without children. This includes 10.3 million low-wage workers, 2.8 million low-wage Black workers, 10 million white workers. And we know it also benefited many families with children. We know that if we could have passed something as simple as the Build Back Better plan, and we challenged as not being enough, and we believe the church should be challenging as not being enough, but it was a start. We know that it would have provided universal pre-care for 3-4-year-olds, 6 million of them. That did not happen. We know, however, that in this pandemic, since it started, in America alone, the billionaires made $2 trillion, and trillions of dollars were given to profit-driven entities without any restrictions. But every conversation about the poor is how can we means test it? How can we make sure they're not gaming the system? And the church must challenge this. Lastly, we know that what we are seeing are immoral choices that people are forced to make that are robbing the poor of their rights and making children and women and children pray. What we know, an estimated 5.2 million children worldwide have lost a parent or a caregiver to COVID-19. What we know in the US, United States, more than 167,000 children under 18 have lost a parent or a caregiver. The church cannot be silent on these matters, nor can we stutter, nor can we be affable on these matters. As Zora Neale Hurston once said, if folk hurt you and you don't say anything, they will kill you and say you enjoyed it. That's a poet from the Harlem Renaissance. We know that Black and Hispanic children were 2 times more likely, and Indigenous children were 4 times more likely to lose a parent in the midst of COVID. We know that deaths have disproportionately impacted poor children, and particularly the children of people of color. We know that there are huge impacts on schools that have been underfunded and neglected for decades. And so when COVID hit, the schools were not prepared. They already weren't dealing with the current realities before COVID. We didn't have enough resources to keep children, teachers, and staff. And lastly, we know that even as people are talking about lifting a mask mandate, one thing that's cruel about that is we want to rush to so-called get back to normal. But children under 5 in some places are not eligible to be vaccinated. Therefore, they are among the unvaccinated. And therefore, when you do the mask lifting, you put children at more risk. And here is the thing the church must know. None of this harm has to exist. And we cannot be silent anymore. We cannot just talk in our forums. We have to have a response, even in the street. That's why in America on June 18th of 2022, we're calling for a mass poor people's low-wage workers assembly and moral march on Washington and beyond to do 3 things: reset the moral narrative by putting a face on the pain, making people see the children and the parent, not creating something where people can speak on behalf of others, but where they, the greatest moral authorities in the world, poor and low-wealth people, can speak. Number 2, to build power among poor and low-wealth people. And number 3, to place before the nation a redemption agenda, a reconstruction agenda, an agenda that literally says it's not about begging folk to do right by the poor, that countries in the world cannot survive themselves if we don't address the issue of poverty around this country and how violent it is and how destructive it is. And it doesn't have to be this way. And so we've got to decide to save the future of the world. And the truth of the matter, as the scriptures say, the builders, the stones that the builders have rejected, the poor, those who are hurting, low wealth, the stones that the builders have rejected have now become the chief cornerstone. It is the only possibility of building a world, building democracies, building nations that can sustain the tension. It is to address 5 issues: systemic racism, systemic poverty, ecological devastation, denial of healthcare, the war economy, and the false moral narrative of religious nationalism. And the church was born and built 4 times like these. We must engage now. For Jesus' first sermon was not the Spirit of the Lord is upon me to have a seminar. Not the Spirit of the Lord was upon me just to teach people how to have a private relationship with God. The Spirit of the Lord was upon me to preach good news to the poor. And in Greek, that word is patokos, P-T-C-H-O-S, which means those who have been made poor by what Jürgen Moltmann called violent public policy and economic exploitation. It is the calling of Jesus and the calling of the prophets, and that for us to engage. And even if the world does not listen, Ezekiel said that God told him, I'm sending you to a world and a nation that is stiff-necked. And they may not hear you, but at least they will know that hath been a prophet among them. That is where we are. And what we will probably find is the same thing Ezekiel found, is that the answer, the moral authority, is in the valley of dry bones. And if we dare to speak to and lift up the poor and low wealth of this world, they actually can help this world move out of the nightmarish realities that we see existing and push us to a better day. Amos said last, in Amos chapter 5, he said, God told Amos in the midst of a time of deep injustice, I need you to call a meeting. And the meeting needs to be the remnant. And I need the remnant of people to wail and cry like something is wrong. I need them to shut down everything, go into the streets and cry and say, not on our watch, not now, not us. And then the text says that God said to Amos, when I see this meeting, when I see the prophets and the impacted people wailing and lamenting and forcing the world to see it's wrong, then I will make my visit. That's what God literally says, then I will make my visit. That text actually comes before let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. It is the call for a meeting of conscience, an assembly of the righteous, an assembly of love, assembly of truth. And it must be led with the church standing with poor people, not for them, not over them, but with poor and low wealth people. Because none of this has to be. And at every point, we must ask the question of the African proverb, how are the children? I don't care whatever else is happening. If the children are dying, and the children are sick, and the children are hurting, then we have a problem, and the beloved community has not come. Let us join together. Let us hear the call of Jesus, and let us hear the call and responsibility of the church. We cannot stand idly by while people are legislating evil, even in the midst of the pandemic, and making women and children pray, P-R-E-Y, and robbing the poor of their right. The poor have a right to life, love, justice, uplift, housing, living wages, healthcare, human rights, and the church must be at the forefront of addressing morality and moral public policy by creating and engaging in a moral movement that does not just stay limited to the pulpit, but even is willing to stand in the street with the people in order for the redemption of the very soul of the nation in the world. God bless you, and thank you so very much.
Thank you so much, Reverend Dr. Barber, for your rousing call to action to not be complacent of the accelerations of already alarming inequities. We have a few moments to discuss, and then we'll take a brief break, and then we'll come together one more time to consolidate our ideas before we break for the meeting. But before I ask all of you to join in, I'm going to ask Pearl from Zoom to join in because she sent along a note that she wanted to join our discussion. So Pearl, would you please ask your question? Pearl?
Sorry, I was muted. I actually wrote that comment before you gave me a chance to talk in reaction to Adam's presentation, but I also do want to react to the presentation, the other presentations, especially the presentation about the forms of knowledge, in particular the articulation of the formation, the university, and it's no surprise because of where I am, the formation, the inquiry, and the common good. And my comment there is really that I think that we are at a phase where we had structured this exactly in that format, in the application, the finding out of definite knowledge, and then the application of the knowledge. And I'm not suggesting that this is the way that that particular way is wrong. But what I am saying is that in the age of COVID, in fact, before COVID, but particularly in the age of COVID, that formation, that imagination of the finding out and the application part has landed us into a situation where we are failing to design for intervention for things as they happen. And the reason why I raise this is that I really would like to pursue this concept of convergent science. I think I'm not really I haven't seen this concept, but I really appreciate the sources of this of that particular concept, because I think it will take us somewhere in doing a new form of social science. And my worry over the years has been that we haven't done anything beyond the discipline or the disciplines as they emerged before. Why have we not created new disciplines? Why are we still talking about psychology in the same way in an age where psychology should have been complicated by cultural and religious and cosmological forms, and worried about the boundaries of where it comments with regards to that, but be a different kind of psychology. And I'm just making an example about psychology. I do have another comment or two, but perhaps let me give other people a chance.
Thank you very much, Pearl. I'll open it up to other folks. Thank you.
For Melissa, you are certainly aware that the fact that in the anti-prostitution policies today, there are two main approaches. One is the so-called demand side approach, and the other is the supply side. Now, the demand side says authorities should punish the clients of prostitutes instead of prostitutes. In the Northern European countries, Sweden and Norway, they followed as you know, the demand side, and the results are very, very important. Since in this academy, not last year, but 3 years ago, there was a big concern about that. What is the message to be sent to our governments, various countries, because the demand side is still in minority. Because people believe that the supply, in other words, we have to punish the victim instead of the clients. What's your opinion on the matter?
Is that,
Question.
oh, that's,
They're not mutually exclusive. The model that I think we need to use is a model that does two things, but starts with, as I spoke about in my speech, starts with the provision of basic necessities of life, including cash, if that's the way governments want to do it, food, shelter. So you have to know about prostitution that it's not a choice. Even though we don't see a gun to the head, there's coercion because of poverty and racism and sexism. The sexism says that's all goods girls are good for. So if we provide an option to avoid prostitution, women and girls are not going to enter it. The need for money is what coerces much prostitution in the world. So if we provide an alternative to prostitution for survival, and if we then arrest men who seek to trick, manipulate, coerce women and girls and children into prostitution, that's a pretty good combination approach. Does that answer it? Or, okay.
may I say a word on to Melissa's point? Because I think she just hit on something, and I know I'm across the water, so this is gonna be my only comment because I don't wanna, but when she just mentioned it's coerced, that is so important to hear that. And part of what that means then is we have to, and what we're saying in our understanding in the Poor People's Campaign, we have to have moral analysis, moral articulation, moral attention. We got to put a face on these issues, moral action and moral attainment. Attainment is what can we actually do versus what us being told what we can't do. And all of that has to be held together, and it needs to flow out of examining everything from our deepest religious tenets, moral tenets, and in some places our deepest constitutional or documents like the UN Declaration on Human Rights. We have to have a framework, but we also have to be careful. We have to work hard. And Melissa, thank you for that comment about coercion, that we don't allow the system to force us to address the system individual issue at a time. We have to understand the interlockingness of these evils, that the interlocking injustices of systemic racism, poverty, ecological devastation, denial of healthcare, and so forth. And take, for instance, in prostitution, if you had a living wage and the parents of a person before they entered that, it creates a whole different reality and a whole different community. You can, for instance, in my country, you can work as hard as you want to at a minimum wage job. But in most current areas, it takes 65 to 70 hours a week just to be able to afford to eat meat once a week and have a basic 2-bedroom apartment. And if that's going on in the wealthy nation, my God. So one of the things we have to do is the system wants us to take it piece by piece by piece. We must talk about these interlocking injustices, and we must develop a prophetic imagination before there's ever going to be real transformational implementation. And so lastly, addressing COVID. I go in rooms all the time, Monsignor, and people want to say, well, what's our response to COVID? What's our response to COVID? And many times, Brother Sachs and I have to say, wait a minute, you can't even talk about a response to COVID until you deal with what happened before COVID, because otherwise you'll get in a room and think that if we could just get pre-COVID back, that everything is fine. And the reality is, the interlockingness is, if pre-COVID wasn't so bad and so unequal and so desperate, COVID would not be where it is. And that's part of what the church has to do in drilling down. And as what was it, St. Francis said, We can't accept easy answers, nor can we accept answers that make us think we can address these things like voting rights is over here, living wages is over here, addressing prostitution is over here. We must look at what Melissa just said, all of the coercion, the factors that actually push us and have pushed us where we are prior to COVID. And if we do that work, that unpacking, then the church has a word to the world that the world needs to hear, but is not yet hearing yet, but we'll hear it if we stand together.
Thank you so much for that. Mary has a question first. So thank you so much. These are deeply wicked problems that are coexisting and will take complicated solutions. Mary.
I had a question for Reverend Barber, if you're still on the line.
I can be.
So listening to you and sitting here in the Vatican with Pope Francis, and people are quoting him and very much he's speaking. You and he are speaking the same language and really thinking about justice and what I think of as the true teachings of Christianity. But when you were talking about the word cloud that came from what comes out in the pulpit, and you were talking about how justice and poverty were not there, I wonder, I've so admired your organizing from afar, and I wonder how much luck you've had in reaching out to the more conservative evangelical churches. Is your message in any way making inroads in those communities?
Well, I would say three things. I say the first thing Jesus had to be, for instance, to touch the Pharisees was to just be Jesus, an incarnate embodiment of truth and loving the poor. And then Nicodemus and others came around. So sometimes your first concern is we first in the church got to be who we're supposed to be. And the scriptures tell us over and over, we have not called the meeting that needs to happen in the public square. If the church is in 50,000 sermons are examined and the word poverty and those issues are not even registering, then before we talk about how we reach outside of Jerusalem, to use a text from Acts, we must start in Jerusalem. We must start among ourselves. There is a repentance that has to go on in the church in order for us to have more impact outside of it. And so part of what our movement is saying is let's begin where we began. And it must begin with poor and low wealth people. And the metanoia, repentance, has to start. And somebody had Isaiah, I'm a sinner and I live in the midst of people with unclean lips. We have to start there. Our lips have not been clean. You remember in the Old Testament when the prophet had to heal the pot because they were eating out of a poisoned pot. So we've got to change the pot. And lastly, in Ezekiel chapter 22, it's an amazing scripture that it haunts me because God tells Ezekiel, your politicians have become like wolves. But the reason they have become like wolves is because the preachers have told them things that God has not said. So that's the first thing. Secondly, yes, we have had quite a bit of success because we don't wait for people to come to us. We mobilize in Appalachia and in the Delta. We have had a lot of people who actually have said to us, they are tired of people calling themselves conservative evangelicals or liberal. Those are terms that are not even biblical. Let's talk about what is the essence of what it means to be Christian. And the true evangelicalism starts with good news to the poor, healing to the brokenhearted, recovery of sight to the blind. And then lastly, what we know is as if it's not happening inside, then we have to have this meeting. We have to have a moral Pentecost. We have to have this meeting that amazes me how in the scriptures change comes when there are these meetings, the meeting in the dry bones, the meeting at the Red Sea, the meeting that God called Amos to, the meeting in Selma, in the civil rights movement, the meeting in Seneca. There has to be a watershed moment, a moment that is generationally transformative, where the people most hurt become the voice and the face of the movement. And that presence in itself will force a reckoning, a dealing with the issues. But what we know is there's been no major transformation in policy and uplifting the poor and addressing the great moral issues of our time and before time, where there has not been a moral fusion movement and people came together, not for a day, but for a declaration, not for a moment, but for a movement. And so that's why we're mobilizing for June 18th. I hope others are going to join around the world, but we must be who we're called to be first. That's the only hope to reach others. You have to know who you are and be that person. And then secondly, yes, we are reaching. Yes, we are in areas. And lastly, we're finding out that a lot of people have been lied on. We were told by the pundits that poor, low wealth people vote against their own interests. When we did some studies and found out, no, they don't. Most of them don't vote. Why? Because they never hear politicians or the church talking about their issues. What we found is that they are waiting and have been waiting to be a part of a movement that lifts up and says distinctively, we're going to address the issues of poverty and low wealth. So there is a waking up giant in the country and in the world. It's being forced by the pain upon us. And if there's a negative good in COVID, I struggle with saying that, but I will say it for the point of conversation. We can't just ignore 1 million deaths. We can't ignore, and there's a place in which people are saying, wait a minute, this is not right. It was not right before, and it's certainly not right now. And we are seeing them coming together across all kinds of lines. One of my closest friends in the movement was trained in white evangelicalism. He's a leader now organizing a group called Red Letter Christians in America. And they are mobilizing with the Poor People's Campaign. And I could go on and on, I won't take the time. But I do know the more and more and more we be who we're supposed to be, there is a power in incarnate reality, in putting a face on it. If it wasn't, God would have never sent Jesus in flesh. There is a power of incarnate reality, and it's time for the church and poor and low wealth people to be that incarnate reality in the world and say, not on our watch, not anymore. We can't accept this. This is a better way. We must have a moral reset.
Thank you very much. Jeff, and then we'll finish with Ashish.
It's wonderful to have Reverend Barber with us, and wonderful to have President DeGoia also with us, two giants who are doing so much. And I was just reflecting on the fact of how similar the language was that they used about the interconnectedness of these very hard problems. And it's the same language that many of us used. And I wanted to mention just a couple of points from the academic side, which President DeGoia mentioned. We're not intrinsically organized in academia to address such interconnected problems, because they cut across areas of knowledge, first of all, and they are very deeply contextual, which is often different from the general principle approach that is favored in academic research. It strikes me that there are three appropriate responses to that in practical terms. One clearly is that successful approaches to problems such as poverty, problems such as pandemics, problems such as climate change, inherently are across traditional disciplines. I think this is obvious. And new disciplines are taking shape, and many new organizational structures in universities are already in place or are taking shape. We've been in dialogue with hundreds of university presidents in recent months in the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, and I've been extremely gratified by the amount of experimentation underway in universities around the world, because universities were not equipped for these problems, but are getting themselves equipped. So that's a first point. Second point is that this kind of research is very difficult without being engaged in the problem solving itself. In other words, it's very hard to do this as an informed spectator. You have to be engaged because it's too complex to observe from the outside. When you're in the middle of a struggle, you know where obstacles come. You're hit by the beam in the head here, and you're hit from here, and you're tackled there, and it's impossible to know these things from a traditional intellectual approach. It's impossible to understand them. At least I'll say it was impossible for me completely to understand the issues I was working on until I got involved in actual problem solving. And when I did, what my colleagues were saying many times just didn't resonate anymore. You don't quite get it, what's happening in these issues. So this is a second point that I think is, again, different from normal experience where objectivity, distance, observe from the outside, don't get involved, don't become engaged, is purely epistemologically, not morally, not ethically, just understanding doesn't work. So that's the second point. This is not laboratory research. This is not looking under a microscope. This is not looking through a telescope. So the third point for me is, but what right do you have to get engaged? Who are you to be solving someone else's problem? What are you doing? Isn't that presumptuous and arrogant and so forth? And I think that there are two parts to that. One is, of course, for a university to be engaged, somebody has to ask. So this is very clear. This is not an imposition, and I think that there's a lot of professional and practical ethics involved in that. But there's a second issue which I find very pertinent. The whole world has agreed on many goals. I start with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. That's a set of specific, agreed precepts, of course, unachieved. The Sustainable Development Goals have been agreed by all 193 member states. And as Reverend Barber knows well, SDG number 1 is end poverty. There you are. Of course, climate change, biodiversity conservation, ending all forms of modern slavery are in there. And so that is agreed by everybody. The Paris Climate Agreement is agreed by 196 signatories, including all 193 UN member states. This gives us a certain purchase of action. A certain standing, I believe, as universities and as engaged intellectuals as well. These are globally agreed problems. We're not even setting the goals. The goals are there. What I know absolutely for a fact is however one looks at the so-called political will or the balance of political forces and so forth, governments have no idea how to solve these problems. So aside from I don't like political will exactly as a construct, but aside from the political forces at play that lead to no solution, there's also a pure understanding, a design issue. Governments do not have the skills inside to be able to solve these problems. That's not why the politicians went into office. They're not trained for it. In general, they're very poorly trained, except on getting elected or being good at meetings or giving a good speech. It's a very particular range of skills, maybe being a good conciliator or a good coalition builder, but it is not this kind of problem solving. So there is a natural role here. And I just want to thank Jack for bringing it up, and we're working on the Poor People's Campaign in the Sustainable Development Solutions Network actively in following Reverend Barber and at his requests for data and analytics. And we need that broad, multidisciplinary approach. I'll say one slight out-of-date quip, but when I, in my early career, had an opportunity, an amazing opportunity that was world-changing to help end a hyperinflation, my dean said to me in the hallway one day, "That's very nice, but when are you going to get back to your real work?" It was a statement, I remember it, it was 34 years ago. I will never forget that moment. I don't think deans would say that now. It was said in a semi-jocular mode. I'm not sure to this moment exactly how much, but it was very much the ethos of Harvard when I was there in those days, at least in my part of the university. And I think it's changing for the good.
Thank goodness he didn't listen to you.
Well, so I was going to actually make many of the points that Jeff made, and so let me just, I won't repeat them. Let me make a quick point, and I'd love to hear from those of us, those joining us by Zoom, particularly Dr. DeGoia, what he thinks about this. I do think over the last 2 years, there's been, in my mind, a failure of universities to step up into a void where political leadership has clearly failed us in many, many countries, including the United States. And it's at those moments that you expect civil society organizations, I think of universities as one of them, to step in, step up. I mean, there's been phenomenal research, so that part's been good, but we want more from universities than just that. And I think Jeff actually laid out a moral case and an argument for why. But I still think the incentives within universities is still very much aligned towards papers, grants. I think that comment that your dean made, I suspect would still be made, maybe still only half jokingly, but still half jokingly, half serious. Yeah, that's the problem. So one of the things I've been thinking about is what has this pandemic taught us about how universities need to be reformed, to change, to address the pressing social problems of our time in a way that is more than just academic. I suspect that's the number 3 common good that Jack was mentioning, but I'd love to just hear his thoughts on how do we get universities to have more courage, to have more clarity, that this is part of their job. Their job is not just to get research grants, write papers, train students, but actually to be deeply engaged in the world.
I'd be happy just to provide a quick response. I know there are others who are in line for questions, but thank you very much for the question. If I could also express my appreciation to you, not just for the question, but for all of the insight that you've provided all of us over the course of these last 2 years. When I think about who do we turn to, I have a son at your school, and I would just say, who do we turn to? We turn to folks like you in this moment. So I was asked to speak about inquiry, and maybe I can also just say a word about Pearl's earlier question. When I refer to the 3 elements of the university, I think that describes universities over time. Historically, if you sort of step back and you ask, what is it we ask of our universities? We ask for them to engage in the work of formation of our young people, that we provide the home for the scholarship and research of our faculty, and we contribute to the common good of the communities in which we participate. I focused my remarks on that second one. If I had focused on the first, I might have shared some thoughts about how formation in a university differs from perhaps in other contexts, whether it be the military or in entrepreneurial sectors or in religious orders, with athletic programs, in professional teams. But there's something about the work within a university that both brings together the commitment to knowledge but also to provide those resources that I was trying to share in my reflections on discernment, to provide those resources that will enable young people to have the tools to make meaning in their lives. I think we have those resources, and I think they're deep within our institutions. If I had focused more on the third, the common good, well, I think you're a living example of it. You've been contributing to the common good in every public presentation I've seen you over the course of the year. Jeff is engaged in, well, everyone that we've had the privilege of hearing from is in their own way. This very convening is a contribution to the common good. I think your challenge to universities is profound. I would say that it's one that, this has been my home since I was 18. So I came here in 1975, and I point out that time frame because it was at a moment where the Jesuit order, the order that formed Pope Francis, was going through a significant transformation. And the fundamental challenge led by its leader, Father Pedro Arrupe, the fundamental challenge that was posed to us as universities, are we equal to the demands of justice in the world? Those were his words. And I would say that for the 45 plus years that I've been a part of this place, we've been wrestling with that question with some of the same failures and same limitations and same constraints that I think are at the heart of your challenge. But I also think your instincts are 100% right. I think Jeff's comments a moment ago are 100% right. We know we have to find new ways of contributing to the common good. And if we take our inspiration from Reverend Barber's comments, that we have to be equal to the demands of justice in our world. And I can only say I agree. We've got much more work to do.
Might I respond to that question as well? And thank you. One of the points we have a piece called the 14 points of moral mobilizing, moral organizing, and organizing what we call fusion movements, not coalition. And one of those points is you must be engaged deeply with academia. That there's not a separation. In other words, we don't play that game of separating other. We actually have a whole group of scholars that are, as Jeff said, and they're not just studying the movement, but are in the movement, right? In it deeply. So for one instance, I want to just put on the table, Jeff, I invited you, but you know where your real invitation came from? It came from Pam Morrison and those white poor women up in Appalachia, many of them whom people have written off in West Virginia. It came from Mr. Pringle, who's a Kansas farmer, who's watching farmers commit suicide and then try to make it look like murder so that at least their families can get their insurance money so they can survive. It came from Janita down in Texas, a Black mother and woman. They were the ones that said, Reverend Barber, go get us some economists. Go get us some people that can footnote our anger. Go get us some people that have thought about this deeply and that can examine every policy we're pushing so that when folk come against it and say it can't be done, we can say, Here's a whole group of economists that are actually saying that what we're talking about is not only the moral thing to do, but it's the economically sound thing to do. And so I wanted just to say that there is a clamoring among the movement. There's an intellectuality that goes with the movement. There's a part where folk in the movement know they're right. And they wish, I never will forget the day that Jeffrey Sachs came to West Virginia and stood beside Pam Garrison, a miner's daughter, a poor low-wage miner's daughter. And when he finished, she was in tears. She said, and now we have the facts on top of it. I mean, there was a sense in which that the movement has to be drawn together. It's not like you have inspiration over here and information over here, because true inspiration will have information, and true information must inspire. It's not just benign. And then the last thing is that this is not without model. It was in 1940s that Richard Niebuhr, the Niebuhr boys, Reinhold out of Yale, and Howard Thurman and others came together, and they formed two groups, two institutes that would operate on predominantly Black campuses like Howard and also some Ivy League and other universities. And one of them also was the Institute of Religion. And in the 1940s, they developed a discipline, and it was to look at Jesus's militant love as an ethic for bringing down Jim Crow. And they said, if we do this right, we will produce the future religious leaders and students that will tear down Jim Crow. Guess who was in one of those classes? Martin Luther King, Jane Foreman, Paulie Murray. I could go down the line. These scholars actually were intentional about forming an institute that would deal with the greatest issue facing the nation in terms of racism and Jim Crow. We're working on something similar to that, but my point is, prophets have to have schools of prophets. History tells us the prophets in ancient Israel were among the greatest intellects in the world. And so it is not really an either or. I appreciate, President, what you just said is so important that we must ask, institution must ask, do we even care about the students in our schools? What is our responsibility to the future? But also hear the cry of the movement. We don't need everybody. The movement doesn't need everybody, but it does need this group of committed academicians that are touched by the movement. And the movement is saying, here's the last part, how do we get universities to shift? How do we get politics to shift? The movement understands you must create the kind of creative tension that makes it unavoidable. In other words, we have to make it so by putting the right face on it, and not just a day in Washington, but a whole movement, and building power that makes addressing these interlocking injustices unavoidable in this moment. And that's the gift that the movement is bringing. And then we know that the gift of an additional gift of academia is to footnote that movement, to say when people say, oh, this won't work. No. This is exactly the thing we have to do, because in the movement, we like to say, the worst thing you can be is loud and wrong. We don't want to be loud and wrong. We do want to be loud, but we want to be right. And we want to be able to say emphatically and with all of the structure and intentionality of academia and all of the power of the spirit and the bodies of the people, that if we continue down this way, what we say in America is, this is constitutionally inconsistent, it's morally indefensible, it's politically insensitive, but it is also economically insane. That the society cannot stand the tension of nearly 50% of your people living in poverty and low wealth in the richest nation in the world. The tension, even the Constitution says you can't establish justice, you can't ensure domestic tranquility if you don't establish justice. And if you think January 6th and the insurrection just in our country was something, imagine if 140 million people lose hope. I mean, most of those folk were high wealth people above. What if 140 million people lose hope where they don't have to? And they're not going to lose hope because they're building a movement. And when you put that and academia in the room and our deepest religious faith, we may not change everything, but we can build a movement in this moment in time to fundamentally shift some of the realities that we see. We are not optimistic, but we are hopeful. And that's different, because hope knows we're going to have to change. We can't keep doing the same thing we're doing, but the change is upon us. And Brother Jack, thank you for, I should say, Mr. President, for what you said. But I want Jeffrey to know, I invited him, but I want him to know deeply it was the movement. Go get us some economists, because we know we're right. And so the movement is crying for you all in academia, and to play the Pacific role that you play in a way that can empower what the movement is doing.
Parola, may I also respond to this line?
Yeah, go ahead, Adam. Yes, absolutely.
I'll be very quick.
Sure.
I think Jeffrey Sachs laid out the challenge brilliantly, and Ashish Jha identified the barrier to meeting this challenge, because the incentive structure in universities is not to support this kind of work. But we are pursuing it. The future of higher education is social impact research. We have an institutional challenge grant, which is challenging universities to build partnerships, to build the capacity of organizations to use evidence, as Reverend Barber described. and to reshape the incentive structure within universities to incentivize partnership-oriented engaged scholarship. And universities are responding. Just recently, the University of California system, prompted by two of our grantees, Emily Ozer at UC Berkeley and Rebecca London at UC Santa Cruz, have written in engaged scholarship into their tenure and promotion guidelines. Cornell University, another of our grantees, has created a division of, with a vice provost of outreach and engagement, provided grants for faculty member to pursue engaged scholarship. It is a culture change, and it can be seeded from the top, but ultimately you have to convince not just provosts and deans, but department chairs and faculty members that our valuing of scholarship that informs research is an arbitrary criteria, that we can also value scholarship that solves problems for real people on the ground. To do so through partnerships, as Jeffrey mentioned, to do so on an interdisciplinary basis, and to do so in a way that we build in reward structures, both incentive structures and reward structures into universities, is feasible, it's doable. And that's what we're working on at the William T. Grant.
Thank you so very much, Adam. You're absolutely right. And you've been on the forefront of touting the importance of this work. Perhaps one of the few silver linings in a crisis like we've just faced is a reminder of why this is not just a lofty ideal, but essential. So I know that you all have been dying for a cup of coffee, and I know there are two of you who would still like to make a comment, but let's take a quick 15-minute coffee break, and we'll be back for and I promise to bring Fernando and Pearl on for your questions or comments, and then I'll turn it over to Marcelo for the wrap-up. Thank you. Thank you so much again for your important contributions.
Recording stopped.
Okay, no, all right. I'm going to bring us back for a question from Pearl, and then a question from Fernando, or a comment from Pearl, and a comment from Fernando, and then I will turn it over to Marcelo.
Recording in progress.
So Pearl, and then we'll end with Fernando before turning it over to Marcelo.
Hi.
Hi,
I just wanted to put a spanner in the works. First of all, I want to appreciate the papers that I was listening to. You would realize why they resonate with me in terms of the nature of knowledge that they discuss. But I wanted to put a spanner on the works using Melissa's paper and ask about the issue of fundamentalism, actually. Let me just give a short anecdote. In South Africa, anthropologists used to be very worried about tribalism and ethnicity, and almost be scared to talk about ethnic groups, your Xhosa, Sesotho, Zulu, as if it was some kind of an African primate modalist notion that encouraged conflict. And that was rightly so in those times. However, it looks like when we focused on the nation and when we focused on any other identity, it seemed to have a scope to be fundamentalist as well. If you look at how South African versus foreign became a basis for xenophobia, I'm seeing a similar notion around cultural reference and religious reference generally, to a point where even the notion of human rights risks being fundamentalist. And so if I'm listening to Melissa's bold issue of restoration of the concept of this is prostitution, and it is actually something that is degrading, that you wouldn't list in a career list, and therefore the issue of the human rights approach that says thou shalt protect the human rights of the sex workers to practice their trade is actually problematic. So you have a situation where people who are using human rights are so fundamentalist in their own orientation that a moral issue is disregarded. You have a situation as well where knowledge in the religious circle is also reified to a point where you can actually see it making fundamentalism of patriarchy in the notions of quoting scriptures about men the head, woman the neck, women must support, but the context is not cited. Sometimes those are the fundamental issues that make women suffer a certain categorization, sometimes to a point of violence that is subtle in home setting. So I think that the issue of the potential for knowledge to be reified to fundamentalist levels deserves some kind of attention in our space of analysis. And I know that I have disregarded the notion of children specifically, but what I'm saying is that wherever there are human beings, we can abuse knowledge and reify it to a point where we classify people, and then even the most liberal concepts such as human rights can actually have negative impact. Thank you.
Such an important point. I'll bring Fernando, and then Melissa, you can respond. Thank you.
Thank you, Carola. I wanted to go back to the conversation of universities and how they can help us address the COVID crisis and build back better. Because it seems to me that the big innovation since the UN was created in 45 and today is the proliferation of universities around the world, 28,000 of them. I mean, think about the capacity, the human talent residing in those institutions. And I think it is in recognition of that potential that this report on the futures of education, which I mentioned yesterday, for the first time since the 3 reports that have been written, addresses universities in every single chapter on that report. The first report, produced in 72, devoted 2 lines to higher education. The second report, published in 96, devoted 2 pages. This report on the transformation of education talks about university in every single chapter, essentially saying this will not happen if universities do not make it happen. But the question is then, so how do we get these 28,000 universities to actually do what they can, which Jack has described, Adam has described, Jeff has described? How do they get them to do engaged scholarship in partnership with organizations that are solving real problems? And I will refer exclusively to the field of education, which is where I work, by which I mean K through 12 education. I wonder if a simple thing that could be done, in addition to the incentives that Adam and his colleagues are working, is to change how we evaluate universities. When I look at what has distorted, corrupted universities in the last 20 years, are the rankings. Not because there is anything wrong with the rankings, but because the rankings measure the wrong things. The rankings that we currently use to assess universities, which I assure you matter to Jack, they matter to Marcelo, they matter to each and every one of our presidents and to our trustees, essentially are measuring how many people do you exclude and how many papers do you publish in journals that your colleagues consider prestigious. Has no connection to whether those journals have any impact. But I do think that we could all learn from something that Jack has supported in Georgetown, in, I think it's called the Center for the Study of Education and the Economy, which has done pioneering work in beginning to change the conversation of higher education by making information available to the public about the employment prospects of people who study in different fields and in different institutions. And I can tell you that that information is powerful. I served for 7 years on the Massachusetts Board of Higher Education. This was the period when Val Patrick was governor, when President Obama was president. And we began to engage our universities in a simple exercise of saying, we need to give information to the public on what are the employment consequences of pursuing different fields in different places. Boy, did we get universities to push back. It was tough. I mean, they went straight to the governor. They went to Congress because our universities really are beholden to many masters. We know that. And so I wonder if this group, this academy, couldn't begin an exercise when we began to measure, so what is the social impact of the university? But let's just start counting. How many of these partnerships do you have with schools and what do they achieve? Not partnerships that produce papers in the same journals that have high impact factors that no educator actually reads, but actually begin to document what difference are you making in how many teachers we produce, what kind of teachers, changing the schools. I think this is entirely doable. Maybe we should ask Jack to lead this effort, building on what you've done already with the Center for the Study of Education of the Economy. I do think that universities respond to that information. In this book, which I didn't mention yesterday, which is a study of how a number of universities during the pandemic partner with K through 12. To be very frank, one of my reasons to write this study was to get more universities to do the same thing. So for example, I intentionally didn't study Harvard, but I studied Arizona State University and MIT. And then I gave these to my president and I said, look what our colleagues at MIT are doing. And you know what? We all respond to those things very well. We all respond to knowing what is the university next door, the one that I'm comparing myself with. So if we had systematic information that we could provide to trustees, to societies, to our students, I'm convinced that our students are ahead of the faculty and university administrators in really wanting to address the SDGs. And if we began to make visible for them, this is a university that is actually going to help you, is going to give you the skills that will make a difference. And this is a university where maybe you will learn to write papers in high impact factor journals, but they don't do so well in terms of helping you gain these skills. I think it's an experiment worth attempting, at least on a small scale. That's what I wanted to say.
Melissa, I'm sorry. We have 15 minutes to wrap up, so I think we should end on this if that's all right with you.
Later, I need to correct some misinformation.
Just in the interest of the overall conversation, we have a time problem. Fernando, thank you very much for that. That was very insightful and lots of food for thought, actually. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I will be very, very brief. I will make 3 points. First, I bring you greetings from Monsignor Marcelo Sanchez Sorondo. Monsignor is today in the border in Misiones, in the border between Argentina and Brazil, in the beautiful jungle and in the beautiful Iguazu area, who was sent by the Holy Father, and he has sent via WhatsApp his warm greetings and his gratitude to all of you for making the journey. Some of us in vivo, some of us in virtual, to participate in this conversation. So thank you, muchas gracias from Monsignor Marcelo. Second, we will develop, we have customarily, and it is the codified. Oh, there is Monsignor. Marcelo, decí unas palabras, por favor. We can hear you, we can hear you. I think you're on mute.
Okay, one moment. Gabriela, one moment, please. I follow all the meeting from Argentina, from Misiones. I am here already. I arrived, and it was fantastic. Congratulations for the different speeches and also for the discussion. Really, I think that the conclusion could be very important for us, and it's very important to have an orientation. Congratulations and many thanks to all the participants. Many thanks, Marcelo, for organizing this. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcelo. Thank you, Monsignor. Thank you so much. We have been asked and gently urged by Monsignor. It is the codified and customary practice to develop a joint consensus statement, all of us together. And this will be first published by the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences, and Monsignor will bring the statement to the Holy Father, who will read it carefully, review it, and therefore our responsibility is to produce. Our responsibility is to produce a pithy, on-point, clear statement about the consensus we have arrived over the last 2 days of our work together. So I will be asking you, and some of us have already done so. Fernando, thank you for your exemplary work in this. Thank you to David Bloom and a colleague. Aisha, thank you so much for already sending us the synthesis of what you would like to see in a common statement. If you can collect your thoughts, be brief, and send us, you can send it either to Stefania or you can send it directly to me, a brief synthesis of the points that you believe are most significant emerging from your own journey and from your own contributions during our work together. So that's the second item. If I could have those by the end of the week, early next week, I will endeavor to produce synthesis, and then I will, before proceeding, I will send that back to you for your A or nay, and you can sign your name to the statement, or you can choose not to sign your name to the statement. So that's the second item. The third item is the University of California Press has indicated a strong interest in publishing the chapters that will be rewritten in the next few months as part of a very, very interesting and a very special new initiative of the University of California Press. What they propose to do, following the standard scholarly peer review process, is to release the book as a book, but also to release the book as a free online downloadable option. And the press has had a lot of success in distributing important interdisciplinary work that has international implications through this new vehicle. So what I will work very closely with Monsignor Marcelo. I will take the lead in working with you in the development of the book version of our joint work together. We have this will be the third. We have two wonderful, wonderful presidents with Jeff and Stefania and so many of us. We will release soon the book based on the work inspired by Pope Francis's Global Education Compact. Will be released by Columbia University Press in the next few months. And I'm very, very honored and very happy with that book. The book it has a preface by the Holy Father, and we will make sure that you all get copies of the book when it is ready. An earlier version of this work was again inspired by the call of the Holy Father to address systematically the issue of forced migrants and refugees. And that was a volume that was developed in the University of California Press series, and is a very, I think, important contribution. And I think it has one of the earliest real systematic and serious studies on climate change as a driver of mass migration by our colleague Ram Ramanathan and his colleagues at the University of at the Scripps Institute in UC San Diego. So I will reach out to each and every one of you with some general guidelines for the development of the next iteration of your contributions. I very much hope that you will have them back to me by, let's say, September 1st. That will give you enough time to reflect upon our joint work together, to update your contributions, and to add perhaps perspectives that flow from the nature of the conversations and the exchanges that we had during our 2 days of work together. And I will then take the volume once we are ready to Naomi Schneider. Mary, you know Naomi well, who will work with us in developing, in first getting the book reviewed and approved, and then developing the print and the online free downloadable online version for publication. With that, I want to say how grateful I am for your journey. These are very, very difficult times, and coming to Rome at this time, I think, embodies the ethic of care, the ethic of responsibility with which we are endeavoring to get in our own individual and as importantly, collective efforts to respond to the call of Pope Francis to outline the contours of this pandemic in the context of all the pre-existing structures and processes that we've come to discuss over the last 2 days, and to imagine and to build the vehicles for a world that remains ever more miniaturized, ever more interconnected, and ever more fragile. With that, I'm grateful. I hope you have a safe travels back home, and we will continue our endeavors together. Thank you very much.
Hi, thank you.
For those of you who joined us via Zoom, thank you so much for your engagement, your thoughtfulness, your deep contributions. We missed you in person.
Thank you. The same, Carola. Warm hugs.